My name is Alicia Baker, and I'm a captain in the United States Army. At 34 years old, I've commanded hundreds of soldiers and faced situations most people only see in movies. But the moment that broke me didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in my own living room. A few years ago, I came home from a deployment, and my mother threw a party. When a neighbor asked what I did, my mother just laughed and answered for me. Oh, she does some little administrative thing for the Army. Our Annie is the real star. She said it while holding up a newspaper article about Annie's latest marketing success. The room filled with polite laughter, and I just stood there, in my dress uniform, feeling smaller and more worthless than I ever had before. That scar never healed. They didn't know that my little administrative thing was about to become the main event at Annie's glamorous engagement party, and that their laughter was about to die in their throats. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you've ever had your own accomplishments diminished by your own family. This story is for you. The air in Grand Isle, Louisiana, was thick enough to chew. It was a toxic cocktail of diesel fuel, brackish floodwater, and the damp, decaying scent of the bayou itself. For 36 straight hours, this had been my world. My face was raw, chapped by the relentless wind and stinging rain of Hurricane Cronus. My fatigues were stiff with dried mud, a second skin caked over a body that ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled into my bones. I stood on the hood of a Humvee, my boots planted firm, and surveyed the devastation. The water, a murky, churning brown, still rushed through what used to be streets. Uprooted oak trees lay like fallen giants, their roots clawing at the sky. This was the aftermath. This was my office. For the last day and a half, I'd been in command of an Army Corps of Engineers team. We'd cleared roads blocked by debris that looked like a giant had emptied his pockets, and we'd rescued a family of 4 trapped in the attic of their home, the structure groaning under the strain of the floodwaters, threatening to collapse at any moment. I can still see the little girl's face, her eyes wide with terror as my sergeant pulled her through a hole we'd cut in the roof. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, but as I looked out at the chaos, a quiet, fierce pride burned in my chest. Just ahead, one of my soldiers had planted a small American flag on a pile of rubble that might have once been a local diner. It was a makeshift gesture, a small act of defiance against the storm's fury, but it was everything. This was my world. It was messy, chaotic, and dangerous, but it was real. It was a world where actions mattered more than words, where your worth was measured by what you did, not by who you knew. I belonged here. As a brief, fragile silence fell between gusts of wind, the memory ambushed me, as it often did in these quiet moments. It was from that party, years ago. I saw Annie, my younger sister, dazzling in a shimmering cocktail dress, her arm linked through mine. She was pulling me toward her circle of friends, their faces flushed with wine and laughter. "This is my sister, Alicia," Annie had announced with a bright, dismissive smile. "Don't worry, she's harmless." The group erupted in a peal of laughter. It wasn't intentionally cruel laughter, it was light, unthinking, which somehow made it worse. It was the kind of laughter you give to a child's silly joke. My mother was standing nearby, sipping a Chardonnay, and she smiled too. It was a smile of approval, a smile that confirmed Annie's assessment. Harmless. The word had lodged itself in my mind like shrapnel. It didn't just mean safe. In that context, it meant insignificant, unimportant. A piece of furniture in the room of her life, someone you could pat on the head and safely ignore. In that moment, standing in my own family's living room, I realized I could have evaporated into thin air and no one would have noticed until it was time to clear the empty glasses. I remembered a quote I'd once read from General Patton. "Measure a man by how he stands up after falling, not by how he falls." I had been trying to stand up from that fall ever since. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from the memory and back to the humid Louisiana air. I pulled it out, the screen glowing against the gray twilight. A string of text messages from my mother. My heart did a familiar, tired little flip. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe she'd seen the news about the hurricane, but there was no, "Are you okay?" No, "Are you safe?" The first message was a picture. A lavender bridesmaid dress, elegant and simple. The second message followed immediately. Mom, you're wearing this. No arguments. I stared at it. The color of a calm spring morning, so alien in this landscape of brown and gray destruction. The third message popped up. Mom. And remember, do not wear your uniform to the party. It looks so funereal. Funereal. I looked down at my mud-caked uniform, the uniform I had worn while pulling that terrified little girl to safety. The uniform that meant everything to me. A funeral for what? For their perfect family image. Then came the final message, the one that landed like a hammer blow to the chest. Mom, I told everyone you do administrative work for the government. It's just less complicated that way. I squeezed the phone so hard I thought the screen might crack. Administrative work. With one simple lie, my mother hadn't just simplified my life for her friends, she had erased it. She had erased the deployments, the training, the command, the 36 hours of grit and leadership I had just endured. She'd replaced Captain Alicia Baker with a quiet, harmless clerk who wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. Before I could even process the sting, another message came through. This one was from Annie. Annie, you have to be there. But please, no stories about the hurricane or the army. Mason and his friends are all SEALs. They don't want to hear anything tacky. Let's not make it heavy. A dry, mirthless smile touched my lips. Tacky. Leading a mission that saved 27 people from rising floodwaters was now considered tacky. Making an entire community safe enough for first responders to enter was heavy. I stared at my calendar app, the date of the engagement party circled in digital red. My fate was sealed. The orders had been given, not by a commanding officer, but by my family. 3 days. I just had to survive 3 days in the role they had written for me. 3 days as the harmless, administrative older sister. The flight from Louisiana to South Carolina was a blur of exhaustion and flickering cabin lights. I had my noise-canceling headphones on, listening to a Brené Brown podcast. Her voice was calm and steady, talking about courage and vulnerability. Vulnerability is not weakness, she said. It's our greatest measure of courage. The words resonated somewhere deep inside me, but felt like a language I hadn't yet learned to speak. I was trained to be the opposite of vulnerable. I was trained to be a fortress. But right then, I felt like a fortress with crumbling walls. Stepping out of the Charleston airport was like stepping into a different country. The air was clean, tinged with salt from the nearby Atlantic and the sweet scent of jasmine. Gone was the oppressive humidity and stench of decay. Here, everything was pristine, perfect. The palm trees stood in disciplined, perfect rows along the boulevard. The historic homes, painted in soft pastels of peach and sky blue, were meticulously preserved, each one a postcard of Southern grace. It was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that felt demanding. It made me feel suffocated, acutely aware of the mud I felt was still under my fingernails, the grit still in my soul. I felt like a smudge on a white silk dress. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was my mother. Mom, have you been to Saffron's boutique yet? I had a dress put on hold for you. Try to look a little feminine. I don't want Mason's friends to think we have a weird daughter. Weird. Another word for their collection. I'd been harmless, complicated, and now I was weird. It was their polite, middle-class way of saying I didn't fit into the perfect picture they had so carefully curated. I decided to get the worst of it over with and called Annie. The phone picked up on the third ring. I could hear the clatter of silverware and muffled voices in the background, the sounds of party prep. Annie's voice was distracted, airy. "Oh, hey, you're here," she said, as if I were a catering delivery she'd almost forgotten about. "Listen, be on time tonight, okay? And, did Mom talk to you? Just don't bring up work. I don't want Mason to feel like he has to compare notes or anything. He's a SEAL, you know. It's a whole different league." I swallowed, the lump in my throat feeling hard and dry. A whole different league. The words stung more than she could ever know. It wasn't just about making Mason feel comfortable. It was about her own insecurity. She was terrified that her fiancé, the elite Navy SEAL, might actually look at me and see something other than the harmless, weird older sister she'd always painted me as. She needed me to stay in that box to feel safe. "I get it," I said, the words tasting like ash. It was the same answer I'd given 100 times before to 100 similar requests. I ended the call and found a small, quiet coffee shop off King Street, the smell of roasted coffee beans a welcome comfort. I needed a moment to ground myself, to connect with the one world where I wasn't an inconvenient accessory. I opened my laptop to check my work email, expecting routine updates, logistical reports. But one email stood out, its subject line in stark red letters, urgent. It was from Corps Command. My heart seized. My fingers felt cold as I clicked it open. The message was brutally short, stripped of all military courtesy. It was a punch to the gut. The inquiry into my command decision during Hurricane Cronus hadn't just been filed. It had been escalated. An official complaint had been lodged by a junior officer. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. A cold dread washed over me, a feeling I hadn't felt even when the floodwaters were rising around my Humvee. My career. The one place I was Captain Baker, not harmless Alicia. The one place where my judgment, my strength, my very essence had value. It was my fortress, and its foundations were suddenly cracking. The ground beneath my feet, the only solid ground I had, felt like it was splitting apart. That night, sleep was impossible. My hotel room overlooked the quiet, historic streets of Charleston, where gas lamps cast a warm, golden glow on the cobblestones. The city was peaceful, asleep under a blanket of Southern charm. But inside me, a war was raging. I've always been a soldier, comfortable fighting one enemy at a time. But this was different. I was fighting on two fronts at once, one against the quiet, insidious judgment of my family, and the other against a threat that could end everything I had worked for. The loneliness was crushing. It was a profound, suffocating emptiness that felt heavier than any rucksack I'd ever carried. In my go bag, I kept a small pocket-sized Bible, its cover worn smooth from years of use, a habit I'd picked up in basic training. I wasn't looking for a miracle. I was just looking for a little bit of solid ground. I flipped it open to the page I always did, the paper thin and soft under my thumb. Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. If you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle all by yourself, with no one in your corner, please support this story with a like, and comment the word alone below. Let's show each other we're not the only ones. Tonight, that valley felt deeper and darker than ever before. And for the first time in a long time, I was afraid I was walking it completely on my own. The Uber dropped me off in front of a sprawling historic mansion in the South of Broad neighborhood. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Majestic oak trees, draped in ghostly Spanish moss, stood sentinel on either side of a manicured lawn. Warm golden light spilled from the tall multi-paned windows, promising an evening of elegance and celebration. The air was fragrant with the heady perfume of magnolias and gardenias, a scent so thick and sweet it felt like a silken veil. For a moment, a tiny, foolish flicker of hope sparked within me. Maybe tonight could be different. Maybe I could just be a sister at a party. The hope died the moment I stepped through the grand double doors. The inside was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Caterers in crisp black uniforms moved with silent efficiency, arranging massive bouquets of white peonies on linen-draped tables. The air chimed with the delicate clinking of crystal glasses. And there was my mother, her eyes scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. The lavender dress I'd picked up from Saffron's felt simple, almost plain, amidst the opulence. I felt hopelessly out of place. Her eyes landed on me, and she immediately glided over, her smile tight and practiced. There was no hug, no warm welcome. Her first move was to reach out and tug at the shoulder of my dress, smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't there. "Stand up straight, Alicia," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hum of authority. "You look like you're bracing for combat." Before I could even respond, her hand was on my elbow, steering me away from the main hall, away from the arriving guests. She led me through a swinging door into the bustling heat of the kitchen. The air here was different, alive with the savory smells of garlic butter and grilling shrimp. A sous chef glanced up at us, then quickly looked away, sensing the tension. My mother bypassed the champagne flutes and handed me a glass of ice water. It felt less like a refreshment and more like a prop. "Listen to me, Alicia," she began, her voice dropping to a serious, conspiratorial tone. "I need you to understand something. Tonight is Annie's night. Your sister has worked so hard for this, to build this life, to find a man like Mason. Everything has to be perfect." I nodded slowly. I'd heard this speech, or versions of it, my entire life. The Annie's night speech, the Annie's graduation speech, the Annie's first job speech. It was a familiar refrain, the background music of my existence. But she wasn't finished. She leaned closer, and this time her words had an edge as sharp as a shard of glass. "Mason comes from a different world. His family, they're prominent people, Alicia. I don't want them thinking we're unrefined." The word hung in the air between us, smelling more foul than the kitchen garbage. Unrefined. Me. I was the unrefined element that threatened to tarnish her masterpiece. "I understand, Mom," I said, my voice weary. I could feel the familiar weight of resignation settling on my shoulders. "I won't say anything about—" She cut me off, her perfectly manicured hand landing on my shoulder. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a grip, pinning me in place. She looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time, I saw past the maternal concern into the cold, hard fear that was driving her. "It's not just about not talking, Alicia. I need you to be faded. I need you to blend in." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but her eyes were unwavering, resolute. "Annie is very sensitive. You know that. Your success, this powerful way you carry yourself, it makes her feel insecure. You're her big sister. It is your duty to protect her feelings. Don't turn her engagement party into some kind of competition. Just be my harmless Alicia for one night. Can you do that for me?" The sentence hit me with the force of a physical blow. It is your duty to protect her feelings. It was no longer a request. It was an assignment, an order. My role in this family was not to be a daughter, but a shield. A screen to project Annie's light upon by making myself dimmer. The words were a verdict, a life sentence, slamming the door on any last, lingering hope I had for being seen. I remembered something an old colonel at West Point used to say. "In the fog of war," he'd lecture, "trust your compass, not the screaming around you. Your compass is your integrity." But in this room, the screaming was silent, and my compass was spinning wildly. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I just looked at my mother, the woman who had given me life, and was now demanding I put that life away, tuck it into a dark corner where it wouldn't cast a shadow. A strange numbness began to spread through me, starting in my chest and radiating out to my fingertips. The anger was gone. The sadness was gone. All that remained was a cold, hollow void. I was used to being overlooked, to being minimized. But this was the first time she had said it out loud. The first time she had explicitly acknowledged that my existence, as I was a problem to be managed. Slowly, I gave a single, stiff nod. My voice, when it came out, was flat, devoid of emotion. "Yes, Mom." I would play my part. I would be the faded, harmless, administrative sister. I would be a ghost at the feast. But what neither of us knew was that tonight, the stage curtain was about to be torn to shreds. I did exactly as I was told. I found a quiet corner near a towering fiddle-leaf fig tree, nursing my glass of water, and made myself as small as possible. I became part of the wallpaper. The party was in full swing now, a symphony of smooth jazz from a live trio, the cheerful chatter of Charleston's elite, and the constant musical clinking of glasses. I watched my mother circulate through the room, a gracious hostess in her element. At one point, she gestured vaguely in my direction while talking to a group of her friends. "Ah, yes, and that's my eldest, Alicia," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, before quickly steering the conversation back to the main attraction. And what an attraction she was. Annie, radiant in a simple but impossibly expensive white silk dress, was the undeniable center of this universe. She stood beside Mason, her hand resting possessively on his arm, laughing at something he said. Every eye was drawn to them. I was exactly what my mother had ordered, a shadow no one noticed. The role fit uncomfortably familiar. But the peace of invisibility never lasts. My mother's best friend, a woman named Carol with perfectly coiffed silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, broke from her circle and zeroed in on me. She held a half-empty glass of champagne like a scepter. "Alicia, dear, isn't it?" she asked, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that set my teeth on edge. Her eyes, however, were not sweet. They were analytical, scanning me from head to toe. "Your mother tells me you're in the military. How fascinating. Do you drive one of those big trucks? Or perhaps you have a nice, safe desk job somewhere?" Before the condescending question could fully land, a man I didn't know, with a red, florid face and a booming laugh, leaned in. "Has to be HR," he declared to the small crowd that had started to gather. "She's far too petite to be doing any of the heavy lifting." They chuckled amongst themselves, a smug, self-satisfied sound. It was the laughter of people who believed they understood the world perfectly. I felt a familiar coldness settle in my stomach. A quote from Theodore Roosevelt, one I'd had to memorize at West Point, echoed in my mind. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." These people weren't just critics. They were spectators jeering from the comfortable seats. All I could manage was a tight, brittle smile. It was a mask I had perfected over many years. Then, the final betrayal. My mother drifted over, not to rescue me, but to join the circle. She placed a chummy hand on Carol's arm, aligning herself with them, with me on the outside. "Oh, you all, stop teasing her," she said. But her voice was laced with the very same amusement she was pretending to scold. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. "Her job is important too. Someone has to file the paperwork so the real soldiers can go out and fight, right?" The group erupted in another wave of laughter, this one louder, more confident. The words, coming from my own mother, hit me with a physical force. They hurt more than any insult from a stranger ever could. She hadn't just failed to defend me, she had picked up the knife and delivered the final, twisting cut herself. In that moment, the elegant ballroom, with its sparkling chandeliers and fragrant peonies, felt like a hostile interrogation room. Across the room, I noticed a distinguished-looking older gentleman with the unmistakable posture of a military man. A retired army general, I guessed, watching our little group. His expression wasn't pity, but an intense, analytical curiosity. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and heavy, and the walls of the grand room seemed to be closing in. My only thought was escape. I needed to get out, to find a quiet place where I could reassemble the pieces of myself. Just as I was about to turn and flee, Annie and Mason passed by. Annie shot me a look, a sharp warning glare that clearly said, "Don't you dare make a scene." But Mason, who had overheard the tail end of the conversation and the burst of laughter, stopped. His easygoing smile vanished. He looked at the circle of amused faces, at my mother still standing beside Carol. And then his eyes landed on me. He saw me standing there, perfectly still, my face a blank mask of composure. But a man trained in observation, a man who had survived by reading the subtlest cues, saw something else. He saw the truth. His posture shifted. The affable fiancé disappeared, replaced by something harder, more focused. He stepped forward, and his voice, calm, deep, and clear, cut through the lingering laughter like a command. "Actually," he said, addressing the group but looking at me, "speaking of the military, we were just studying a fascinating training operation down at Coronado recently." The circle fell silent, their attention immediately shifting to him. He was, after all, the guest of honor, the Navy SEAL, the hero of the evening. They leaned in, eager to hear a story from the world of special operations. I just stood there, frozen, unaware that the story he was about to tell was my own. Mason held the room's complete, undivided attention. He was a natural storyteller, and the guests were captivated, leaning in to catch every word. He began talking about the Hurricane Cronus relief effort, painting a vivid picture of the chaos on the Gulf Coast. He described it as a textbook case of what they studied in special operations, a study in controlled chaos. He was detailing the most critical moment of the operation. A convoy, loaded with life-saving medical supplies and MREs, was approaching the last viable bridge, the main artery into a community of thousands who were completely cut off. And the CO on the ground, Mason was saying, his voice resonating with professional admiration, had a split-second, gut-wrenching call to make. The intel was shaky. Stick to the primary route and risk the entire convoy on that bridge, or divert to an unvetted secondary route and lose hours of precious time that people didn't have. Something inside me, some deeply buried instinct, took over. It wasn't a thought. It was a reflex, a twitch of muscle memory forged in the crucible of command. My mind was no longer in a Charleston ballroom. It was back in the howling wind and rain, staring at a satellite map, the lives of soldiers and civilians weighing on my every decision. My voice emerged, not loud, but with a clipped, authoritative clarity that sliced through the hushed ambiance of the party. That route was not viable, I stated, the words devoid of any social grace. The diversion was to Highway 190. The bridge on Interstate 12 was already compromised by floodwater. Based on the engineer's final report, it had a catastrophic failure probability within 10 minutes. I spoke the words as if I were in a tactical operations center delivering a battlefield update. It was a statement of cold, hard fact. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the ballroom. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air and life out of the room. The gentle jazz music from the trio faltered, a single confused note from a saxophone dying a lonely death before it, too, went silent. Every whisper, every murmur ceased. I could feel the heat of my mother's and Annie's eyes on me, twin lasers of disbelief and white-hot fury. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had spoken out of turn. I had stopped being invisible. But Mason didn't look annoyed. He didn't look offended that I had publicly interrupted and corrected him. His entire bearing shifted. The easygoing charm of the fiancé evaporated, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of an operator. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. It was a penetrating, analytical gaze that bypassed the lavender dress and the carefully constructed mask of composure on my face. It was the look of a professional recognizing another. Across the room, the retired general's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but with a sudden, sharp glint of understanding, like a hunter who has just spotted his quarry. Mason's voice was different now, stripped of all social pleasantry. It was the direct, incisive tone of a man used to getting immediate answers in high-stakes situations. "How do you know that detail?" he asked. I held his intense gaze, my own voice remaining steady even. "I was there." 3 words. That's all it took. 3 words that landed in the dead silent room with the concussive force of a physical impact. On Mason's face, a flicker of disbelief warred with a sudden, dawning comprehension. It was like watching a complex equation solve itself behind his eyes. He straightened his posture, rising to his full height, his eyes scanning me with a raw, unconcealed astonishment. He wasn't looking at his future sister-in-law anymore. He was assessing an unknown variable on the battlefield. And then he took a half step forward, commanding the space. He asked the question that detonated the entire evening. He used my full rank and title, his voice resonating with crisp military formality, each word a hammer blow against the flimsy, pathetic lies that had defined me in this world. "Are you Captain Alicia Baker?" he asked, his voice ringing with authority. "Commanding Officer of Task Force Alpha, 82nd Airborne Division, Disaster Relief?" The silence that followed was so thick, so absolute, it felt like a physical pressure. It was a silence filled with the frantic, unspoken questions of every guest in the room. I saw my mother's gaze dart wildly from Mason to me, her mouth hanging slightly agape, her carefully constructed world beginning to fracture right before her eyes. Annie was rooted to the spot, a statue of pure disbelief, the color draining from her face. For the first time all night, I lifted my chin. I felt a quiet, solid certainty settle deep within me. I met the stunned eyes of Carol, and the red-faced man, and my mother, and my sister. And then my gaze returned to Mason. My voice was firm, unwavering, and clear. Yes. What happened next destroyed the carefully constructed fantasy of the party forever. Mason, the elite Navy SEAL, the celebrated hero of the night, snapped to attention. He brought his heels together with a singular percussive crack that echoed like a gunshot through the stunned silence of the grand ballroom. Then, his arm shot up, his hand slicing the air in a perfect, razor-sharp salute. His fingertips touched the brim of an invisible patrol cap, his arm a rigid line of profound, unambiguous respect. It was a gesture delivered from one warrior to another. It was directed, with unwavering precision, straight at me. Across the room, as if connected by an invisible thread of discipline, 3 other men, Mason's SEAL teammates, also snapped to attention, an unquestioning chain of command, their bodies rigid. The retired general broke into a slow, deeply satisfied smile, a look of pure vindication. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Carol, her mouth open in a perfect O of shock, let her champagne flute slip from her trembling fingers. It shattered on the polished hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud, violent, the only noise to break the spell. Annie brought a hand to her mouth, a choked, inaudible sound escaping her lips. Her eyes, wide with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, were locked on me, as if seeing a terrifying stranger for the very first time. For the first time in my life, standing in the crosshairs of my family's world, I didn't have to shrink. I didn't have to fade. Instead, I stood anchored in my truth as the entire room was forced to recalibrate around my unshakable center of gravity. For a long moment, the only sound in the opulent ballroom was the faint, tinkling echo of shattered glass. Mason held his salute for a beat longer, a silent, powerful acknowledgement before lowering his hand. He turned to the stunned, silent crowd, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying the weight of indisputable authority. The relief operation Captain Baker commanded during Hurricane Cronus, he began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the thick tension, is now being used as a case study at Coronado. A wave of murmurs rippled through the guests. Coronado. The word itself was legendary. It's a study in decisive leadership under extreme pressure, Mason continued, his eyes briefly finding mine again. Her voice on the comms, the clarity of her commands in the middle of that storm. It's something every SEAL candidate is required to listen to and learn from. He then turned his head slightly towards the retired general, who was still watching intently. Isn't that right, General? The general, a man who radiated a lifetime of command, gave a firm nod. Absolutely correct, he confirmed, his voice a low rumble. Captain Baker's after-action reports are a masterclass in clarity and decisive action, a model for the officer corps. The validation from 2 unimpeachable sources sent another shockwave through the room. I saw someone in the back pull out their phone, their thumbs flying across the screen. A moment later, his voice was a disbelieving whisper that was somehow audible in the quiet room. My God. It says here she saved 27 people. Those words were like a series of hammer blows, not to me, but to the fragile, carefully constructed world of my mother. She took a hesitant step toward me, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes were wide with a kind of dazed horror, as if she were looking at a complete stranger who had inexplicably taken her daughter's place. You're a captain? She stammered, the words sounding foreign and unbelievable on her tongue. Alicia? Why? Why did you never tell me? I looked directly into her eyes, into the swirling vortex of confusion and denial. And I said nothing. Because I had told her. Not always in words, but I had told her with every late-night call from a different time zone, with every holiday missed, with every promotion, with every ounce of dedication I had poured into the only life that ever made sense to me. I had lived that truth in front of her every single day. She had simply chosen not to see it. My silence now, in this shattered room, was louder and more damning than any accusation I could ever make. It was Annie who broke first. Her shock curdled instantly into a hot, defensive rage. She strode towards me, her beautiful face flushed a deep, ugly red with shame and fury. She got right up in my face, her voice a venomous whisper that was somehow more violent than a scream. "What did you do?" she hissed, her eyes blazing. "This is my engagement party. Why do you always have to make everything about you? You planned this, didn't you? You did this just to embarrass me." The accusation was so breathtakingly irrational, so completely self-absorbed, that it almost defied a response. She hadn't heard the truth. She had only heard the applause for someone else. She saw my moment of vindication as her moment of being upstaged. Mason, hearing her words, frowned deeply. He gently took her arm, a restraining gesture that she angrily shook off. It was in that chaotic, emotionally charged moment that my phone vibrated in my clutch. A new kind of cold, far sharper than the chill of my mother's disapproval, shot through me. I pulled it out. The screen displayed a single, encrypted message from Command. My heart stopped. The words were stark, brutal, and stripped of all context. Suspension advisory in effect. Report to JAG office, Fort Bragg, 0800, HRS, immediate. The irony was a cruel, physical blow. In the very instant I had finally reclaimed my honor in the eyes of my family, it was being threatened in the only world that truly mattered. The victory was hollow. The ground I had just gained crumbled beneath my feet. I had to go, now. My training took over. Emotions were a liability. The mission was all that mattered. I turned to Mason, giving him a single, curt nod of thanks. It was all I could offer. Then I faced my mother and Annie, my face a neutral mask. "I have to go." Annie let out a sound that was half scoff, half sob. "Work, of course, I knew it," she cried out, her voice rising, finally finding its volume. "You always put your stupid job before this family." I looked at my younger sister one last time. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, glacial calm. "This isn't my job, Annie," I said, my voice quiet but as cold and hard as steel. "This is who I am. If you believe that our true family should be the ones who build us up, not tear us down, please hit the like button and show your support by commenting, 'I stand with Alicia' below." And with that, I turned my back. I walked away from the shattered glass, from the wreckage of my mother's perfect party, and from the smoking crater where my relationship with my family used to be. I walked straight out the door and into the cool Charleston night, a soldier marching toward her next war. I burst out of the mansion's grand entrance and into the cool, humid embrace of the Charleston night. The sudden shift in atmosphere was a relief, like coming up for air after being held underwater. I didn't look back. The sounds of the party, the smooth jazz, the shocked whispers, the ghost of laughter, faded behind me, along with the image of my mother's stunned face and Annie's incandescent rage. They were scenes from a life that no longer felt like mine. My rental car was parked down the street. I got in, the cheap fabric of the seats a stark contrast to the opulence I'd just left. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. There was no time for the bittersweet satisfaction of my vindication, no time for the deep, aching sorrow of my family's betrayal. The moment I put the car in drive, the emotional part of my brain shut down and the command officer took over. A new mission had just dropped. My objective was clear. Mission, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. ETA, 0800 hours. Obstacle, a formal complaint that could detonate a 15-year military career. I punched the destination into the GPS, and the calm robotic voice of the navigator became my sole companion for the long night ahead. In 200 feet, turn right. It was a simple, direct order. I could deal with that. The miles dissolved under the tires as I merged onto Interstate 95, heading north. The darkness of the highway was punctuated by the rhythmic, hypnotic glow of the overhead lights, each one a yellow pulse in the vast emptiness. This was my new operational theater. My mind, trained for strategic analysis, began reconstructing the incident, running a mental after-action report. The decision to divert the convoy from the I-12 bridge. Why did I make that call? The data flooded my memory. The engineer's report, ambiguous but leaning negative. The rising water levels, faster than the NOAA models predicted. The wind shear, gusting at speeds that could compromise the structural integrity of an already stressed bridge. It wasn't a guess. It was a calculated risk assessment under extreme duress. My decision had been sound. So, who filed the complaint? The name formed in my mind with near certainty. Lieutenant Miller. A young green officer, fresh from West Point on his first major disaster relief op. I remembered his voice over the radio, tight with anxiety, questioning my order to divert. He'd called it an unnecessary deviation from the op plan. He hadn't seen the bigger picture, he'd only seen the rulebook. He had been scared. And now he was likely trying to preemptively cover his own career by painting my command decision as reckless. He was sacrificing his integrity to protect his fitness report. I needed evidence, hard data. I ran through a mental checklist, communications logs, the complete radio transmission recordings, satellite imagery of the water levels just before and after my decision. All of it was on my encrypted laptop, safe in my go bag on the passenger seat. My entire defense was in that bag. We have a saying in the Army, the 6 Ps. Proper planning and preparation prevents poor performance. My entire career had been an exercise in the 6 Ps. This would be no different. Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed on the center console. An unknown number with a California area code. My first instinct was to ignore it. I wasn't in the mood for wrong numbers or telemarketers, but something made me reach for it. Baker, I answered, my voice flat. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a familiar, deep voice. Captain Baker, it's Mason Grant. I was taken aback. Mason? Yeah. Look, I'm sorry for all of that tonight, he said, and his voice was sincere, stripped of any pretense. I just wanted you to know, if you need anything, a character witness, a statement on your professional reputation, anything at all, you have my number. What you did during that storm, the decisions you made, that was the real deal. Truly exceptional. The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely supportive, that for a moment I didn't know how to respond. The man who was about to marry into the family that had spent a lifetime diminishing me was the only one who seemed to see me clearly. Thank you, Mason, I finally said, the words feeling inadequate. I'll keep that in mind. It was a short call, but it felt like a single, steady light in the oppressive darkness of the highway. At least one person in that world saw me for who I am. The first pale pink-gray light of dawn was breaking over the pine trees of North Carolina when I finally saw the signs for Fort Bragg. I drove through the main gate, the young MP in the guard booth snapping a sharp salute as he checked my ID. Here, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of a military installation, the tension in my shoulders began to ease. Here, I wasn't the harmless or weird daughter. Here, I was Captain Baker. I was home. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The fear that had been a low hum beneath the surface had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard focus. I drove to the temporary lodging for transient officers, took a quick, scalding hot shower to wash away the last 48 hours, and began the ritual. I pulled on my crisp Army combat uniform. I laced my boots, pulling them tight. And then I stood before the small mirror, picking up the 2 silver bars of my rank. I carefully pinned the captain's insignia onto my uniform collar. I stared at my reflection, at the woman in the uniform. This was me. Not the faded version my mother wanted, not the tacky sister Annie saw. This was the woman who had earned her place, who had led soldiers, who had made the hard calls. This was my truth. I no longer needed anyone else to acknowledge it. I was ready for the fight. The JAG hearing room at Fort Bragg was sterile and cold. The walls were a pale, institutional gray. The air conditioning hummed with a low, monotonous drone, and the fluorescent lights overhead cast a flat, shadowless glare on everything. It was a room designed to strip away emotion and leave only the hard, unvarnished facts. At a long, polished mahogany table sat the panel. A full colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and a major from the JAG Corps. Their faces were impassive, their posture rigid, their expressions revealing nothing. This was not a jury of my peers. This was a tribunal of my superiors. I stood at attention, my spine straight, my gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above their heads. Across from me, at a separate, smaller table, sat Lieutenant Miller. He looked nervous, his knuckles white where he gripped a pen, but he'd rehearsed his part well. When the presiding officer, the colonel, gave him the floor, he stood and delivered his testimony with a practiced fluency. He painted a picture of a commanding officer who was reckless, who deviated from a carefully approved operational plan, and who needlessly endangered her troops and the mission itself. He spoke of my abrupt and unilateral decision to divert the convoy. He made it sound like I was on some kind of ego trip, a maverick ignoring protocol. The panel listened intently, their gazes occasionally flicking over to me, their faces remaining unreadable. Captain Baker ordered us onto a secondary road that was not on the mission schematic, based on what she called a gut feeling, Miller stated, his voice ringing with false sincerity. The phrase gut feeling hung in the sterile air, an accusation of unprofessionalism, of feminine hysteria. We were fortunate that we didn't encounter any IEDs or enemy combatants, but it was a flagrant violation of established procedure. Courage, sirs, must be tempered with discipline. In this instance, discipline was abandoned. His words sounded plausible. They were crafted to appeal to the panel's deep-seated respect for order and protocol. I felt the weight of their scrutiny, the pressure in the room ratcheting up another notch. The lieutenant colonel, in particular, was looking at me now, his gaze sharp and questioning. I remained silent, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. I waited. I trusted the system. I trusted my preparation. Finally, Miller sat down. The colonel at the head of the table turned his impassive eyes to me. "Captain Baker," he said, his voice neutral. "Do you have a response?" "Yes, sir, I do," I replied, my voice calm and even. I walked forward with measured steps, placed my encrypted laptop on the table, and connected it to the large monitor on the wall behind the panel. The screen flickered to life. "Sirs," I began, addressing the panel directly, "I did not act on a gut feeling. I acted on real-time, actionable intelligence." I clicked a file. A series of high-resolution satellite images appeared on the screen, time-stamped from the day of the storm. "This is the I-12 bridge at 1400 hours, I said, using my laser pointer to highlight the image. "As you can see, the water has already breached the lower supports." I clicked to the next image. "This is at 1420 hours. You can clearly see the beginning of structural fracturing along the main pier." I brought up the next file. "These are the communications logs between myself and Battalion HQ." The logs appeared on screen, a dry, factual record of the unfolding crisis. At 1425, I requested an immediate structural integrity update on the bridge. The response, as you can see, was inconclusive. They couldn't guarantee its stability. My voice was steady, my presentation methodical. I was not a defendant pleading her case. I was an officer delivering a report. I made a command decision based on the best available intelligence at the time. My primary objective was to preserve the lives of the 27 civilians in that convoy and the 12 soldiers under my direct command. The secondary objective was to deliver the aid. A collapsed bridge would have resulted in a catastrophic failure of both. I paused, letting the data sink in. I could see the panel leaning forward, studying the screen. Miller was staring at his hands, avoiding everyone's gaze. "And now, sirs," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "I present my final piece of evidence." I opened one last file, an audio file. I clicked play. The room was instantly filled with the chaotic sounds of the hurricane, the howling shriek of the wind, the percussive roar of the rain against metal. It was the sound of being inside the storm. Then, my own voice, sharp and clear over the radio, cutting through the static. Me, on radio. "All call signs, this is Alpha 6. Be advised, we are diverting." I repeat, "We are diverting to alternate route Bravo. Acknowledge." There was a crackle of static, And then another voice. It was panicked, high-pitched, but unmistakably Miller's. Miller, on radio. Alpha 6, this is Bravo 2. That's a deviation from the op plan. We don't have clearance for that route. Me, on radio. Bravo 2. The primary route is compromised. You will follow my orders. Acknowledge. Another pause, filled with the screaming wind. Then Miller's voice came again, this time subdued, compliant. Miller, on radio. Roger that, Alpha 6. Acknowledged. I let the recording play. For another 30 seconds, there was only the sound of the storm. And then, the final, damning exchange. Me, on radio. Bravo. 2. Status report on alternate route. Miller, on radio. Alpha 6, route is clear. Road is passable. Thank God we didn't take that bridge. Over. I hit stop. The recording ended, plunging the room into a heavy, profound silence. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioner. Miller's face was ashen, the color of wet concrete. He had just, in his own words, testified against himself. His own voice, preserved forever in a digital file, had confirmed the validity of my decision and exposed the cowardice behind his complaint. The presiding colonel stared at the silent speaker on my laptop for a long moment. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to Lieutenant Miller, his expression one of cold, deep disappointment. Finally, his eyes met mine. The impassive mask was gone. In its place was a look of profound, unqualified respect. The storm that had threatened to end my career had just broken. The JAG inquiry concluded with a formal dismissal of the complaint and a commendation added to my record. The storm over my career was over. But I knew there was one last front to visit, one last piece of unfinished business. A week later, I was driving down a long, straight road in Nebraska, flanked on both sides by endless fields of late summer corn, their tassels heavy and golden under the vast open sky. Everything looked exactly the same as it had my entire life. The familiar red barn on the horizon, the faded political sign in a neighbor's yard. The landscape hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't returning this time out of a sense of familial duty or holiday obligation. I was returning to officially close a chapter of my life. I was here to give my own orders. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the front door opened. My mother stood there, framed in the doorway. She looked older, smaller than I remembered, as if the events in Charleston had aged her a decade. The air smelled of cinnamon and baked apples, her signature apple pie, the scent that had always meant home. She stepped onto the porch and pulled me into a hug. It was stiff, awkward, a gesture of uncertainty. "I'm so sorry, Alicia," she whispered into my shoulder, her voice thin and brittle. I just didn't know." Behind her, hovering in the shadows of the hallway, was Annie. She wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on a spot on the hardwood floor. We sat in the living room, the same room I'd grown up in. It felt like a museum of a life that was never mine. The mantelpiece was a shrine to Annie. Her graduation photo from Duke, a picture of her accepting a marketing award, her and Mason on a sailboat, laughing. My high school graduation photo was tucked away on a side table, small and collecting dust. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken words. My mother was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly. She began to explain, a long rambling monologue about how she'd always worried about Annie, how Annie had always been more fragile, more in need of protection. She talked about how she just wanted to build up Annie's confidence. It was part confession, part excuse. She was admitting to the crime while simultaneously pleading her own innocence. Annie finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry, Alicia," she said, her voice barely a murmur. "I was so selfish." The apologies, after a lifetime of feeling invisible, felt strangely hollow, like echoes in an empty room. They weren't born of a sudden, profound understanding of my pain. They were born of their own public humiliation. The apologies weren't for me. They were for them, a way to absolve their own guilt. I was just the priest they were confessing to. I listened to it all. I didn't interrupt. My face remained calm, a quiet observer to their emotional turmoil. I felt no surge of anger, no welling of tears. I'd learned a great deal about surviving storms, both literal and emotional. The key was to find the calm center and anchor yourself there. When they finally fell silent, their apologies hanging in the air, they looked at me, waiting for the easy absolution, waiting for me to say, "It's okay," or "I forgive you." It's what the old Alicia would have done. Smoothed things over, eased their discomfort, taken responsibility for their feelings. But the old Alicia wasn't in that room anymore. I met my mother's gaze, then my sister's. My look wasn't angry or accusatory. It was just deep and still and clear. "I hear what you're saying," I began, my voice even and measured, each word carefully placed. "But hearing it doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase all the years that came before it." I took a quiet breath. I can't be the shadow that allows someone else to shine brighter. I am done making myself smaller. I could see the confusion on their faces. This was not in the script they had imagined. "I will always love you," I continued, and it was the truth. "You are my family. But the dynamic we've lived with is over. I will not shrink myself for your comfort anymore. Never again." I stood up, the movement feeling decisive, final. "I will be at your wedding, Annie. I will stand up there as your sister." I looked directly at her. "But I will be there as myself, as Captain Alicia Baker." Then I turned to my mother. "And Mom, from now on, I hope you can learn to be proud of both of your daughters, for exactly who they are." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. My peace was no longer contingent on their approval. I had said what needed to be said. I walked out of the house, the screen door slapping shut behind me with a sound of finality. As I got into my car and started the engine, a profound sense of lightness washed over me, a feeling I had never known. I didn't need them to change. I just needed them to know that I had. The door to the invisible cage they had built around me had finally been unlocked, and I had just walked out of it, all on my own. 2 months later, I was back in Charleston. Not for a confrontation, but for a celebration. The wedding was held in the same historic district, under the benevolent shade of ancient oak trees. But this time, everything was different. Because I was different. I wore my Army service uniform, the formal, dress blues. The deep blue fabric was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleamed, and the rows of ribbons and medals on my chest, symbols of a life lived with purpose, shone softly in the afternoon sun. I was not hiding in a corner. I stood tall, a quiet but undeniable presence. When my mother introduced me to guests, there was a new note in her voice. It was still a little hesitant, a little awkward, but it was clear. "This is my older daughter," she would say, "Captain Alicia Baker." There were no more dismissive whispers, no more polite, condescending laughter. Instead, there were handshakes. There were nods of respect. There were people who looked me in the eye. The most surreal moment came after the ceremony. Annie, looking breathtaking in her white lace gown, found me near the gardens. She didn't say anything at first, just wrapped her arms around me in a tight, fierce hug. It was clumsy, and I could feel her trembling slightly, but it was the most honest physical contact we'd shared in years. "Thank you for being here, Alicia," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And thank you for being you." This time, when she said it, I knew she meant it. The apology wasn't hollow anymore. It was the beginning of something new, something real. Later, as the evening reception began, Mason made his way over, handing me a glass of sparkling water. He was smiling, a genuine, easy smile. "You look sharp, Captain," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He gestured with his glass towards the joyful chaos of the wedding party. "Family, huh? It's a complicated battlefield." I took a sip of water and allowed a small, real smile of my own. "More complicated than Fallujah," I replied. He threw his head back and laughed, a deep, genuine laugh of understanding. It was a soldier's joke, a shared acknowledgement of the different kinds of wars we fight. Some overseas in the dust and the heat, and some in the quiet, carpeted living rooms of our own homes. It was a laugh between two people who understood the cost of service. A new kind of relationship, one built not on family obligation, but on mutual, hard-won respect, had been forged in the fire of that disastrous engagement party. Back at Fort Bragg, life settled into a new rhythm. My career was secure, my reputation intact. But something inside me had shifted. The storm I had weathered, both with the hurricane and with my family, had left its mark. I realized I couldn't just go back to being the same officer I was before. I had a new mission. I volunteered for the battalion's mentorship program. I specifically requested to work with junior officers, especially the young women just starting their careers. I met with them for coffee, ran PT with them, and sat with them in my office, the door always open. I didn't just teach them tactics or protocol. I shared my story. I talked about making hard decisions under pressure. I talked about the importance of integrity when you're being questioned. I talked about finding your voice in rooms where you feel invisible, and about the quiet strength it takes to build your own sense of worth, brick by brick, when no one else will build it for you. My old pain, the deep wound of being overlooked and undervalued, was transformed. It became a lesson. It became a tool. It became a legacy of strength. The voice that my own family had spent a lifetime trying to silence was now shaping a new generation of leaders. The final piece fell into place on a cool, crisp autumn morning in North Carolina. I was out for an early run around a quiet lake near Post, the mist rising off the water, the air clean and fresh in my lungs. My phone rang, and I almost didn't answer. But I saw the caller ID. It was my mom. I slowed to a walk, my heart rate steady. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, honey," she said, her voice quiet. I just wanted to call and see how you were, and to tell you, I love you." There was no big agenda, no hidden request. It was just a call. "I love you too, Mom," I said. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing and everything, and as I hung up, a profound truth settled over me with the gentle weight of the morning sun. My peace hadn't come from their apologies or their changed behavior. It had come the moment I stopped needing it. It came when I realized my value wasn't up for debate. It wasn't something they could give me or take away. I had found it myself, forged in storms, tested in hearings, and finally claimed as my own. It was defined by my actions, my integrity, and the quiet compassion I was learning to show myself. After a long and arduous journey through battlefields both foreign and domestic, Captain Alicia Baker was finally exactly where she belonged, grounded, respected, and completely, unshakably, free. Thank you for walking this long road with me. My freedom, I realized, wasn't about winning a battle against my family. It was about ending the war inside myself. It was about the moment I decided that my value was mine to define, not theirs to give. Your battlefield might look different. It might be in a boardroom or at a holiday dinner table. But the path to that same peace is always there, waiting for you to claim it. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit the like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone. This channel is a place for stories like ours, stories of strength, survival, and the quiet courage it takes to finally become who you were always meant to be.